Subscribe to our channel and stay updated with all our latest tutorials. Don't miss out, hit subscribe now. In our last video, we created an Analogic application and the first pages within it, the main menu page and the head count page. In the current video, I will show you how to create a grid table and how to parse data into it. The grid table is one of the most important widgets in Analogic. It can be used as a simple data table where the cells only contain data, numbers or strings, but it can also hold other widgets in its cells, such as buttons, switches, icons, etc. Even other tables can be embedded. This allows us to use it for sophisticated data collection workflows or to display complex semi-visual data. The first step is to create a grid table. We can easily do this by hitting the Enter key and start typing Grid Table. I just select the Grid Table widget from the dropdown and name it Grid Table. It automatically gets the KS Academy headcount prefix. After that, we have to create a Grid Table Header Row widget. I will name it Grid Table Header Row and move it one level down in the hierarchy with the Control right arrow. In this Grid Table Header Row widget, I will create a header cell widget. It's very simple. I just start typing and select the cell widget from the dropdown. I also have to name it. Let's call it Grid Table Header Row Cell 1. And inside this cell widget, we want to create a text widget for our column title. So I will select the text widget and name it the same, Grid Table Header Row Cell 1 Text. Once I have created our header row widget, we can create our first grid cell widget and I will name it Grid Table Cell 1. I actually made a mistake and created a grid cell widget instead of the Grid Table Cell widget. But no worries, I can easily change the widget type here in the Properties tab, and now it's a Grid Table Cell widget. Because in this particular example, I want to display text in the cells of the table, I'd also have to create a text widget under the Grid Table Cell widget. This can easily be done. I also have to move it under the Grid Table widget. So this is the most basic way to create a grid table by building the hierarchy manually. But we can also create grid tables much quicker. Now I delete this Grid Table widget that I just created. I can just press the right arrow and click on a widget and select the Generate Grid Table option from the context menu. I have to specify the widget ID, Grid Table, and specify the number of rows and columns, and click on Generate. Now I instantly have our grid table. I just have to adjust the hierarchy a little bit. I press Ctrl and the left arrow and move our grid table into its right place in the hierarchy. And although it is not necessary, I am going to move our header row widget above the Grid Table Cell widgets. So this is our grid table which we quickly generated. I just deploy it and we can check the application. Now we can see that it has generated a grid table. This grid table at the moment does not have a skin, and there is hard-coded data in the table that we can check in the repository GS part. Here you can see this is hard-coded data, but we will fill it with an MDX later. I want to rename the first column header to group name. And I will set the title font weight to 600, and I will do the same for the other text widgets too. The second column name will be Base Salary. And I will set the font weight to 600 here too. I will name the third column to FTE. And the title of the last column will be Bonus. I will use a skin for the grid table that I already defined earlier, and I will only paste it in the Siesta part. You can find this skin in our public GitHub repository. You can see I named it List Table. I will set this as the skin name for our grid table. I press Deploy and check our grid table. In the UI, you can see the header names already changed, and we have some borders too, but we still have to adjust the column widths and a bunch of other stuff. I will set a 25% relative width and a 20 pixels top margin for the grid table, and I think that's all I have to do. Now let's adjust the grid table header cell widgets. I set 10% width for the first one and 4% for the others. I press deploy and reload the application and can see our grid table. It is smaller and more readable. In addition to the interface builder, Cedar also has a model maker module where we can now easily check if our MBX is working and what grid table we need to create. When we enter our model and select the MDX module, we can add a new query here. Let's call it headcount grid table. And we can copy the MDX in. Just like an interface builder, we can change the size of the block. If we click on the Run MDX button, we can see that the MDX has been run and we can see what data is returned. Alright, first things first. We need to set up the URL for fetching our MDX data. The URL is always the same, so you can easily grab it from GitHub and plug it in. Once that's sorted, we set our request type to post. This is crucial for the parsing operations we're about to do. Next up, we need to switch the server parameter to true. Why? Because this will make our system search for the MDX query in the UAML part of the setup. After setting that, we're going to define the body of our request. For this case though, we'll keep it simple and return an empty object because that's all we need at this stage. Moving on to the parsing control, we first change the type to script. This sets the stage for the real magic, where we actually write the script to parse our data. Here's where we start fresh with an empty array for our results, and declare some variables, gives our starting point, and then we have C and step, which will help us manage how many columns we handle in the MDX. For a smoother coding experience, we'll initialize our row count to 0 right at the beginning. Now it's time to dive into the good stuff with our while loop. We kick off this loop with k initially set to 0 and keep it running as long as k is less than the length of the cells we're processing. In this loop, we designate the cell to be our current focus by pointing it at the k index, making it easier to handle data entry for that particular cell. We'll also pull out the members from this cell, sticking them into another variable called dNow for our first column in this setup. We need a title, which we take from the fourth member's name. We set this column's width to 12%, also applying the same width to the actual cell size. For the style, we opt for an admin panel skin and align everything to the left. A padding of 10 pixels on the left should do nicely. Once we configure these properties, we shove this initial column setup into our array. But there's more. Since we need to fill up the remaining columns with data, we create a for loop that runs 3 times. In each iteration of this loop, we adjust our I variable, adding 1 each time to march through the subsequent columns. For these additional columns, we configure each with the formatted value of the cell at the position I plus. The alignment for these will be center left, with the same 10 pixel padding on the left. We'll use a delta report data skin here and set the cell width to 3%. After setting up each column, we toss this config into the array too. After cycling through the columns, we update k by adding the step value we defined earlier. We also increment our row count by 1. Now it's time to push the completely configured row, D, into our results array, result. Finally, after finishing all our rows with the while loop, we wrap up the script by returning the results we've compiled. And there you have it, a detailed walkthrough of setting up and executing our MDX data parsing script from start to finish, ready to integrate into your system. And as I mentioned, while we created the parsing control, I will add some text skin to the CSS, which you can also find on the GitHub. And after that, we need our MDX to put into the repository WAML part. We have our MDX here, and we can press Charles to save it, and we can deploy it. For the grid table header cell widget, I will set the alignment to center left for all of them. And I will deploy our application. And if we change something in the server-side MDX this part, we need to write clear cache after application link, and we will get back an OK message, and we can go back to our application. And after that, we can open our headcount page, and we can see the data populated table. We need to modify a little bit the headers with some padding left. For the text widgets, I'm going to set padding left, maybe 10 pixels, and yeah, it's enough. It also works like we talked about. The first video, if we open the application and see there in 2 different tabs, and I'll set one of the widget config parameters. We can see the changes immediately, and as you can see, it's much better looking. And I think we need to change the column width a little bit to make it look perfect. To do that, we need to go back to the grid table repository GS part and change this white to the same percentage that we set in the grid table header cell part. And if we hit deploy and refresh our application, we will see that we got the right column whites and everything. And that was our first MDX and grid table creation. In this video, we focused on building and configuring a grid table in Analogic. We started by manually creating a simple grid table and quickly generating it using the context menu for efficiency. We then moved on to setting up the MDX data parsing, where we wrote a script to dynamically fetch and format the data. In the next video, we'll enhance the grid table by adding a DropBox widget, enabling users to select and change the year for the data displayed in the table. This will allow the data to update dynamically based on the selected year, making the grid table even more interactive. Stay tuned for the next steps in enhancing user experience and functionality. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to our channel and stay updated with all our latest tutorials. Don't miss out. Hit subscribe now.